Two dogs, inverted schemes, and two different approaches. What we're going to be tackling today is two different methods of painting up some dogs for the Imperial agents. One, we are going to be using predominantly mixing colours, using fewer paints but mixing, while the other we're going to be layering up straight paints out of the paint pot and just thinning them down a little bit. These models were essentially painted in the same fashion, just using inverted schemes. So what was blue is now red and what was red is now blue. So I'm not going to go over painting them individually. Instead, I'm going to do both of them at the same time and talk about them both at the same time. The main thing that you need to realise and work out and remember is that if it's on this side of the screen, then it is the dog that we are mixing colours with. Whereas if it's on this side of the screen, it is the dog that we are not mixing colours with. First, we're going to be looking at the red style elements. On our first red armoured dog, this is going to be nice and simple. We can take our dark red and then use this to apply a consistent base coat across the armour. Meanwhile, on the blue armoured dog, we are actually going to come in with a reddish brown as a base coat, which will cover not only all of the red armour sections, but can also be used to base coat any of the metal and fur sections. We can then layer in our mid-tone colour across the model, getting a nice range of hits and areas with this colour. For the red armoured dog, this is going to come in the form of a brighter red paint, which can be thinned and applied over a couple of coats, while on the other side of the scale, we can take a red and then mix this into our brown, giving us a nice dirty mid-tone between the red and the brown. The red sections will naturally need a highlight layer, giving us a range from a shadowy base coat red all the way up to a brighter, lighter tone. In the case of the non-mixed scheme, what we're going to need to do is take a reddish orange and then lightly apply this across the sharpest edges and the locations of the armour that would get hit by the most light. For the model that requires mixing, naturally, we can take another colour and mix it in. In this case, we are going to be using an orange and adding a small amount of this to the last red layer, giving us a slightly brighter mix. This mix can then be used to pick out all of the sharp points and all of the main areas hit by light across the model. You may have noticed during that scene that the dogs went from being less painted to being thoroughly painted, and that is just because of how we structured it in regards to laying down the base coat. Every single surface got a base coat of its chosen area first, which then gave us a nice ability to look at the rough placement and locations of those colours so that we have a good ratio. Moving across to the blues, the first step for both of these models is going to be to apply a base coat using a dark blue from whatever set of paints that we're using. Now this time let's focus on the mixed painted dog first. Here we can take our brighter blue and then mix this into our base blue. This will yield a softer, lighter tone of blue, and we can use that as our first mid-tone layer. On the other model, we have a much easier choice, which is to pick out our middle blue in our range of blues, and then use this for our mid-tone highlights. Both of these areas were essentially applied in the same way, which was a quick layer covering most of the areas where the shadows would not be. Then we need to finish this up by applying the highlights where the bright spots and light would actually impact. This is one area where mixing can come in a little bit handy. Our bright blue that we're using is actually a little bit bright in order to use a clean jump. But by mixing the blue in with our darker blue, we can make a nice mid-range and then apply another layer of this before we come in with the bright colour itself and then undertake some thin edge highlights. Whereas for our unmixed model, we just need to grab our bright blue and apply our thinner highlights across the areas. Now, it's probably worth pointing out that you should check if you've subscribed, but besides that, what we need to remember is that I'm not sitting here saying that one of these methods is better than the other. You should mix your paints or you shouldn't mix your paints. Overall, the application method we're using is layering, so we are just layering up different colours. The different colours comes in whether it comes straight from a pot or it comes straight out of two pots and then mixed together. So there is a pro and a con, and we will touch on them in the future. However, rather than just list off the exact same thing that we've done, which was multiple layers via mixing, I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of the mixing versus not mixing argument, kind of how I see it, and then we can jump on to some fun, exciting things with the fur, which we will chuck in at the end. On the side of not mixing, there are some easy advantages that we can point out. These predominantly being around record keeping. It's relatively simple to document a recipe if we're not making any mixes. This is because we only need to track the name of the colour used and how we're applying it, whether we are using layers, glazes, stippling, etc. For these models we are using relatively harsh layers, by which I mean that we're not going back and forth, smoothing out and blending any of the transition lines. We could use the exact same paints but apply multiple shrinking thin glazes over the areas to get a smoother transition change. This does unfortunately add a couple of drawbacks. Mainly, we are looking at cost. If you're planning on using multiple separate paints and then layering or glazing them up, you will naturally need to buy a paint for each colour that you're layering up. The other issue is probably more annoying, and that's actually if the paints themselves change or stop being produced. Say for example, Games Workshop make a colour that you use, and then they stop making that. Well, it's just a case of I hope you've bought enough of that paint to last you for the rest of your hobby, or you're going to have to go on a journey to find a similar one. On the other hand, we have mixing, and to be honest, this is generally where I tend to fall in as a category. More often than not, I'm mixing multiple paints. And the advantage here is we don't need a paint for every single colour. We just need essentially the outer sides of the scale. So if we're assuming that we are painting blue and we don't want to add any colour nuances or any other hues in, we can simply take a dark and a bright blue. And then by mixing these together, we can make any blue in the spectrum between those high and low valued blues. Naturally, this does make tracking the overall recipe for painting slightly harder, but can give you overall more control. Mainly in the form of variants. It's really easy to move from a slightly brighter to a slightly darker colour in a mix, and then arrange giving some less dramatic colour changes. As some areas would slowly move from light to dark, we can get that nice transition. As I said earlier, this isn't a video to try and say that one thing is better than the other. Yes, I tend to mix a lot of paints, and I think there are advantages in regards to potentially getting smoother blends. Mainly because if a particular colour has too much of a transition, we can mix them together and then have a nice smoother transition from our dark to our light. We can put in multiple different layers. Naturally, you could do this with the same set of paints that we've used for just the layered one and then mix between your three colours. So it's entirely up to you how you do it. This isn't a pro or a con or do one or the other. Do whatever feels good for you. Now with all that said, what we're going to be jumping in and tackling next and last is the fur on the model, and we're going to be doing something a little bit fun and tweaky with that just to add a little bit of texture. For our fur, let's start off with the dog painted in separate colours, mainly because we need to base coat all of the fur sections here in our base brown. We don't need to do this for our mixed dog, as we are using the same brown that we base coated in earlier, which we applied to the reds, the metals and the fur. With the base down, we can now start highlighting. Taking our mid-tone, we can lay down the highlights across the main raised muscle areas. This will leave a fairly contrasting difference regardless of whether we are using the mixed method or the individual methods. And that is not a problem at all, because what we're now going to do is take our brightest browns and use these as a textured highlight. For this, we are going to use a thin brush and thin down the paint so that we are able to apply many small vertical strokes going back and forth across the overall area of fur, building up in multiple thin passes of many thin lines, which hopefully, when complete, will give us a rough fur feel. Then it's just a case of checking that you've liked the video, taking our dogs and mounting them onto some bases ready for gaming. Obviously, these dogs are from the Imperial Agent Combat Patrol, part of the Vigilant squads that we painted up. And we painted up our Combat Patrol, or most of it, because we've still got some things left to paint. We painted most of that up, themed after the Catholic Church and the Pope, mainly the Vatican army. And if you're interested to see how we did that, obviously these dogs go with the unit, so why not check the unit out here? Otherwise, you're going to need to remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.